Chapter 3. The Man in Ur. I spent 3 years watching Abram before God spoke to him. 3 years of standing on rooftops and walking through markets and patrolling the perimeter of a household that didn't know I existed. 3 years of learning the rhythms of one ordinary man's life in a city that worshipped everything except the God who made it. Abram rose before dawn. Every morning he'd step outside the mud brick house he shared with Sarai and stand in the small courtyard, face tilted up, searching the sky the way a man searches for a ship on the horizon, looking for something he expected but hadn't found yet. Then he'd lower his head and go about his day, and whatever he'd been looking for would have to wait for the next morning. Sarai was the one who prayed. Not at the ziggurat, not with incense or carved figures, but at a small stone she'd placed in the corner of their courtyard. She'd kneel there before Abram woke, whispering in the dark, her hands pressed flat against the stone. I couldn't always hear what she said. When I could, it was usually the same thing. A child. She'd been asking for years, decades, and the stone was smooth where her hands had worn it. I do not know if God heard those prayers differently than I did. I heard them as grief. Not the sharp grief that breaks open at once, but the slower kind. The kind that sharpens instead of fading because every month that passed without an answer was another stone stacked on the pile. Sarai carried it with dignity, but dignity did not make it light. Abram felt it too, though he carried it differently. He didn't talk about it, didn't pray about it where anyone could hear. But in the market, when other men's children ran between the stalls laughing, his eyes followed them. His hand would half reach toward a boy running past and then pull back. He wanted a son with the kind of wanting that lives beneath the skin, too deep for words. And the city around them didn't care. Ur was magnificent, if magnificence can be built on hunger. Canals cut through the city like dark veins, carrying river water past brick walls, crowded alleys, workshops, courtyards, and animal pens. Merchants shouted over one another in the market. Donkeys brayed. Children ran with clay dust on their legs. Scribes sat in shaded rooms pressing marks into wet tablets while men argued over grain, land, marriage, debt, and inheritance. The whole city seemed to be measuring, buying, selling, recording, offering, bowing, always bowing. The ziggurat rose above everything. Its fired brick steps climbed toward a blue-glazed shrine at the top, where the priests of Nana tended flame and ceremony and lies. Every evening, people came with grain, oil, wool, lambs, dates, silver, whatever they could spare, and sometimes what they could not spare. They lifted their faces with such need that I could hardly stand to watch. That was the cruelty of it, yet they were not all wicked. Many were afraid, many lonely, many wanting blessing that no stone could give. But the thing waiting at the top of the steps was stone. The fallen did not invent every false god. They did not need to. Humans were skilled at shaping fear into objects they could touch. They gave names to hunger and carved faces for the dark. They made gods out of moonlight, rain, fertility, power, and terror. The fallen came afterward. They nested in the worship and fed on the misdirected longing. They whispered through priests, arranged coincidences, gave just enough answer to keep the lie alive. A dream here, a healed animal there, a rival struck with fever at the right time. Small signs, small hooks, enough to make people climb the steps again. 3 of the fallen held positions around the ziggurat. Others moved through the market and the king's courts. Their pattern was familiar to me. The temple pulled worship inward. The market tied need to offering, and the rulers borrowed holiness from the priests, while the priests borrowed force from the rulers. Fear moved through all of it like water through a canal. Sariel's work. Not the crude violence of the old days, not open rebellion with blades drawn and banners raised. This was cleaner. He had made the city into a net, and Abram lived inside it. He breathed its smoke, heard its chants, passed its shrines, and did business with men who swore by Nana as easily as they breathed. He walked through a world arranged to bend him by inches. But he did not climb the steps. Not once. He traded in the market, tended his father's household, negotiated, listened, settled disputes, gave orders, counted animals, weighed goods, and answered men who invoked gods he would not honor. He did everything a man had to do to live in Ur. But he never bowed to what Ur bowed to. That was why he held my attention the way he did. His father Taru carried the old stories, the God of Shem, the flood, the ark, the covenant, and the old promise that somehow, through the seed of the woman, the serpent would be crushed. Teru had not forgotten. But he held the stories like a man holding embers in a covered bowl, carefully and quietly, without letting them become flame. He resisted the city without confronting it, refused the lie without challenging it, and kept the old memory alive. But he did not move. Abram was different, and Abram searched. Those mornings in the courtyard were not habit, they were hunger. He was looking for the God Teru described, the God who made the lights in the heavens instead of being one of them, the God who spoke before rivers had names, the God who judged and spared and promised, and remained silent for longer than men knew how to endure. Abram had not heard him, not yet, but he had not stopped looking. Holding position near Abram's household was its own kind of war. I could not move through Ur openly. Sariel's sentries knew the lines of the city too well. The obvious paths were watched, and the high places were marked. The ziggurat cast more than a physical shadow, and anything that moved too close to Teru's household drew attention if it moved carelessly. So I learned the margins, the broken sight lines between roofs, the thin places near wells and thresholds, the moments just before dawn when the fallen assigned to the market shifted attention toward the temple fires. Small openings, brief cover, enough. Most nights were not battles, most nights were strain. A lesser fallen drifting too close to the house and needing to be turned aside. A whisper aimed at a servant's dream. A priest glancing too long at Abram in the market because something about him irritated the darkness. Nothing large enough to summon Michael, nothing clean enough to name, but the cost was real. A slow current is still a current, and you may not notice it while you are standing against it. Then years pass, and your legs remember what your mind dismissed. Then one morning, Sarai did not kneel. She walked past the stone, and that was all. No speech, no anger, no dramatic collapse. She simply stepped into the courtyard, glanced once at the smooth place where her hands had worn the surface, and turned away. She began the day's work. Her face had the settled stillness of someone who had accepted an answer she did not want. I had seen that look on humans before, after the flood. On the faces of those who had lost everything and decided grief was no longer an event but life itself. Abram noticed. He came home that evening as the light thinned over the courtyard. Sarai was grinding grain. The stone sat untouched in its corner. Abram stopped in the doorway. For a long while he did not move. Sarai did not look up, and the house sounds continued around them. A servant shifted a jar, and an animal scraped at its pen. Somewhere beyond the courtyard wall, a neighbor laughed too loudly. Abram crossed to the stone and knelt where Sarai had knelt. He placed his hands where her hands had worn the surface smooth, and he prayed. I moved closer, though I should not have, for it was not necessary. There was no threat inside the courtyard. No fallen presence pressing against the wall, and no tactical reason to change position. I moved closer anyway. His voice was too low for me to hear, even from beside him, but I saw his shoulders shake. Sarai stopped grinding, her hands going still on the stone wheel. She did not turn around, nor did she interrupt him. She only sat there, breath held, while her husband carried aloud what both of them had borne in silence. That was when I stopped thinking of Abram as an assignment. not because he was strong, but because he was not. He was wounded, disappointed, childless, aging, and still searching for the God who had not answered his wife. He prayed anyway. That kind of faith is harder to guard than a city. When God spoke, every shadow in felt it. The air changed first. Not the physical air, but the deeper one. It tightened like the moment before a storm breaks. The fallen around the ziggurat shifted, and one turned from the temple flame. Another abandoned the priest he had been shadowing. A third rose above the blue-glazed shrine and scanned the city with sudden violence in his attention. They did not know what had happened, but they knew something had. Then angels began arriving, not a host but a detail, 8 at first, then more. They came from different directions, slipping through the city's watched places faster than I could track them. Michael came last, descending from the upper regions with a force that made the lesser fallen draw back before he even reached Abram's house. He took position above the courtyard and said nothing, which told me more than words would have. Below us, Abram slept, or nearly slept. The fire inside the house had burned low. Sarai lay beside him, the servants were quiet, and the animals had settled. Nothing in the visible world suggested that history had leaned toward one mud-brick house in Then God spoke. Not through Michael, not through Gabriel, not through any messenger. God spoke directly to Abram. The sound of him drove every angel in range to his knees. I had heard God speak before. At creation, when his words made matter. In the garden, when he called to Adam. At the ark, when he sealed Noah inside and judgment began to fall. His voice always carried weight, but this was different. This was not the voice that split waters or named stars. This was the voice of God entering one man's darkness and calling him out. Abram opened his eyes. He lay still, staring into the dark. The voice told him to leave the land he knew, leave the people who knew him, and leave the household that had given him his name and place. Go to the land God would show him. Not a map, not a route, not an explanation. A command with a promise inside it. Abram's breathing changed. Sarai stirred beside him but did not wake. God continued. He promised to make Abram into a great nation. He promised that Abram's name would matter, not for Abram alone, but for others. Those who blessed him would be blessed. Those who cursed him would meet God's resistance. Through him, the families of the earth would be blessed. A great nation from a man with no child. Blessing for the families of the earth from one household in a city of idols. I looked at Michael. His face was unreadable, but his posture told me everything. This was the moment. The thread I had followed since Eden had narrowed again. From the first promise in the garden, to Seth, to Noah, to Shem. And now to this man lying awake in the dark beside his barren wife. All the scattered nations. All the languages born from Babel's judgment. And God had placed the next step inside Abram's obedience. The thought staggered me, not because God's plan was grand, but because it was so small, one man, one wife, one impossible promise. Abram sat up slowly. His hands gripped the edge of his sleeping mat. He took short breaths, careful breaths, as if any sudden movement might break what had just happened. I had seen humans receive God's words before. It never made them larger at first. It made them feel the size they truly were. He did not wake Sarai, not yet. He sat in the dark until dawn began to pale the edges of the house. Outside the city, the fallen gathered. They came in from the ziggurat, the market, the courts, the outer roads. The river approaches, Sariel's servants abandoned lesser posts and drew toward Abram's household in widening rings. The pressure around the house thickened until the courtyard felt like the center of a siege. Michael deployed us without raising his voice. 12 angels formed the first ring. Others moved farther out, blocking the lines of approach through the city. I took the eastern side, nearest the road that would lead out of Ur. Michael had not assigned me that position. He saw me take it, and he did not correct me. If Abram obeyed, that was the direction he would go. I intended to stand between him and whatever tried to stop him. Abram told Sarai after sunrise. She was in the courtyard, near the stone, not kneeling beside it and not touching it. Just standing close enough that I knew she had been aware of it all morning. Abram came to her with the face of a man carrying fire in his hands. He spoke quietly. I heard only pieces at first, the voice, the command, the promise. Leave. Sarai looked at him. Then she looked toward the corner of the courtyard. At the stone she had worn smooth with years of unanswered prayer. Abram kept speaking. He told her God had promised descendants, a nation, a blessing, a land not yet named. The word descendants passed through her like a blade. I saw it, and so did Abram. For a moment, neither of them spoke. God's promise did not step around her wound. It pressed directly into it. Sarai had asked for a child until asking became pain. Then God answered by calling her into a promise that made the old ache larger, not smaller. She could have laughed then. Not the laugh that would come later, sharp with age and disbelief, but a harder one. She could have asked Abram why God would wait until hope had thinned before speaking of nations. She did not. She looked back at her husband. When, she asked. Not where, not how, not are you sure. When? I had underestimated her. I had spent 3 years watching Abram search the heavens, and I had nearly missed the woman who kept pressing grief into stone and calling it prayer. Her faith was not weaker because it had gone quiet. It had roots under the silence. Abram answered, soon. Sarai nodded once. Then she turned toward the house and began to prepare. Abram went to Tehru next, and I expected resistance. Tehru was old, rooted, and known in Ur. He had survived the city's idolatry by holding memory close and risk at a distance. Men like that do not easily become pilgrims. But Tehru listened. As Abram spoke, the old man's face changed, not quickly, not like surprise, but more like a lamp being uncovered. The God of the old stories had spoken, not to a priest of Nana, not from the blue shrine, not through omen or smoke or carved mouth, but to his son. Tehru's hands trembled. I will come, Tehru said. Abram looked startled, and so was I. Tehru was not seizing Abram's call. He was answering something the call had awakened in him. The old embers had found air. The household began to pack. That was when the city noticed them, not all at once, not openly. But Ur had a way of feeling departures. Servants asked questions, and neighbors leaned over walls. Traders paused too long near Abram's gate. Men who had never cared about Abram's private faith suddenly wondered why he was gathering animals, supplies, tents, and people. The fallen pressed harder each night. They did not attack like fools. Sariel's forces understood patience. They did not rush the house in a swarm and force Michael to answer with open battle. They probed, tested, and tried to make obedience inconvenient enough to reconsider. A donkey broke its tether and nearly scattered half the pack animals. A servant woke shaking from a dream in which the road west ended in a pit. A jar of oil cracked without being touched. 2 men argued near the livestock pen and nearly came to blows over who had counted the animals incorrectly. These were small disruptions, human disruptions, the kind that look like chance until you have watched darkness work for long enough. I fought more during those days of preparation than I had in all the quiet watching before them. One fallen slipped through the northern shadow and reached for the dreams of Abram's led herdsman. I drove him back before the whisper became a decision. Another tried to turn Lot's servants against Abram's, planting a fence where there had only been fatigue. I broke the pressure around them, and the quarrel died into embarrassed silence. A third came at Sarai, and that one I remember clearly. It waited until night, when she sat beside a half-packed bundle of woven cloth. Abram was with Teru, and the servants were asleep. Sarai held a small clay lamp in her hand, worn smooth by use. She turned it over and over, and I could see the weight of leaving settle on her. The fallen leaned close to the courtyard wall, not inside, not yet, and its whisper was soft. You asked for a child, and he gave you a road. Sarai closed her eyes, her hand tightened around the lamp, and the whisper pressed again. Stay. At least here you know your sorrow. I struck before it could say more. The engagement was brief, sharp, and silent to human ears. The fallen recoiled, but not before Sarai opened her eyes and looked toward the courtyard corner where her prayer stone sat. For a moment, I thought she would go to it. Instead, she stood, placed the lamp in the bundle, and tied the bundle shut. I held the perimeter until dawn. Sariel was buying time, and I knew the tactic. He had taught it to me before he fell. You do not always stop an army by meeting it in the field. Sometimes you delay the march. You make the road feel costly before the first step. You let fatigue do what fear cannot. A restless household, a few broken supplies, animals that will not settle. Servants muttering about omens, an old father coughing in the night. A few days can start to feel like a reason to stay. A reason can harden into wisdom. And wisdom can be disobedience with a better name. So we held the line. On the morning they left, Sariel came himself. I felt him before I saw him. The city seemed to quiet around his arrival, not physically. The market still stirred, animals still complained, and men still shouted from distant streets. But beneath those sounds, the unseen order of shifted to make room for him. He appeared on the eastern road alone, exactly where I stood, as if he had known I would choose that place. He probably had Sariel had always been better at reading his opponents than any commander I had ever known. That was one of the reasons I had once admired him. He looked almost unchanged. That disturbed me more than if he had appeared monstrous. Some of the fallen wore their rebellion plainly, their forms bent by appetite and rage. Sariel did not, yet his bearing remained controlled. His face still held the calm authority of one accustomed to command. His eyes were sharp, assessing, patient, but only the warmth was gone. What remained was intelligence without mercy. Kemuel, he said. He spoke my name like a teacher greeting a former student. It has been a long time. Commander, I said. The title came out before I could stop it, a habit born of centuries of training and old loyalty lodged somewhere deeper than judgment. I felt it the moment it left my mouth. The word still fit him, and I hated that it did. Sariel smiled. That title does not apply anymore, but I appreciate that you remember. Behind me, Abram's household formed on the road. Donkeys loaded with supplies, servants tightening ropes. Lot directed his own people with more confidence than patience. Teru sat seated carefully, old but alert. Abram moved from person to person, checking what had already been checked. And Sarai stood near the front, her face turned east. Fear was there, of course it was, but fear was not leading her. Sariel looked past me at them. So this is God's answer. I said nothing. An aging man, Sariel continued. A barren wife. An old father who should have known better than to begin a journey he may not finish. A nephew with ambition in his bones. A household full of servants who do not know where they are going. His eyes returned to mine. Impressive. He is under protection, I said. Of course he is, Sariel said. They always are at first. At first? I said. The important ones get guards, a perimeter, a warrior who believes standing in the road means the road is safe. Sariel glanced toward Abram again. But protection does not make choices for them. No, I said. It gives them room to obey. Sariel studied me. For one moment, the old commander surfaced in him. The one who weighed terrain, weather, morale, weakness. The one who could look at a battlefield and see not what was happening, but what would happen after everyone grew tired. Name one who didn't fail eventually, he said. I did not answer. He lifted his hand slightly. Adam, Eve, Cain, the generations before the flood, Noah, righteous Noah, who survived judgment and still carried corruption into the new world, Babel, where men built upward because they would not bow downward. He nodded toward Abram. This one will fail too. My grip tightened, Sariel noticed. They all do, Kemuel. And God keeps working through them anyway, I said. Something in his expression cooled. You have changed. Yes, I said. Earth has gotten into you, Sariel said. Maybe it was supposed to. That answer displeased him, and it was good. For the first time, Sariel looked directly at Abram, not as a strategist assessing a target. What crossed his face was not strategy. It was hatred, patient and cold. I will not stop him from leaving Ur, he said. Then move. He smiled faintly. That is not the play. Let him walk into the wilderness with his promise. Let him carry hope until it becomes heavy. The desert will test faith better than these walls ever could. He stepped closer before I could answer. I did not yield. Is that a threat? I said. It is patience, Sariel said. I will be watching, he continued. When he fails, I will ask you what I am asking now. Was it worth it? All this effort? All this hope? For creatures who break whatever God places in their hands. I wanted to answer, but I had no answer large enough. Behind me, Abram called for the household to move. The first donkey stepped forward, a wheel creaked, a servant shouted, and Sarai began walking. Sariel heard it, and so did I. He withdrew from the road, not in fear but by choice, and that mattered because he was not retreating. He was allowing the first move because he believed the game would be won later. The caravan left Ur. I went with them, not ahead of them, not behind, but alongside. The eastern road became my station, between Abram and whatever waited. They did not reach the promised land at once. They stopped in Haran. Tehu was old, and the journey wore him down. The road that had awakened him also spent him. Each day took something. His steps shortened, and his breath grew thin. Abram slowed the household for him, then slowed it again. At Haran they stopped. I struggled with that. God had called Abram onward, to a land he would show him. Haran was not that land. It was a trading city, a place between places. Familiar enough to feel safe and distant enough from Ur to feel like obedience. A partial road can look like faithfulness when everyone is tired. He did not abandon the promise, but he did settle near it. Tents became arrangements, and arrangements became routines. The animals found grazing patterns, servants learned the markets, and Lot found opportunities. Sarai made a dwelling out of what was supposed to be a pause. Teru faded. He died quietly, in his sleep, with Abram near him and Sarai at the doorway. The old man who had carried the stories of the true God through a lifetime in Ur had found enough courage to leave when God called his son. He had not reached Canaan, but he had left Ur. Abram buried his father in Haran. He stood at the grave long after the others had gone. His face was turned west. The land remained ahead. The promise remained impossible, and his father was behind him now, under stones. The fallen came while he stood there, not aggressively. Sariel's forces were too patient for that. 3 of them settled just beyond the grave, and the whisper they sent was the quietest kind. Not a lie exactly, just a question dressed as grief. You have brought an old man here to die in a foreign city. Is this what obedience looks like? I held the line between them and Abram. He stood long enough that I began to wonder. Then he lifted his head. I could see the question in him, the same one that had been sitting under every quiet day in Haran. Was the call still alive, or had he mistaken movement for obedience and grief for permission to stop? Then God spoke again, not with many words. He did not explain the delay, nor did he soothe every wound. He did not unfold the whole design so Abram could approve it. He called him onward. And Abram went. He was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took Sarai, Lot, the servants, the possessions they had gathered, the flocks, the herds, the tents, the memory of his father, and the promise of God. Then he walked west. The escort was heavier now, and Michael reinforced the detail. Angels moved in rotating lines around the caravan. Some watched the roads, and some watched the dreams. Some watched the arguments that fatigue tried to grow into division. The fallen paralleled us at a distance. They kept to the ridges, the dry places, the old shrines, the towns where other gods already had names. Sariel was not among them. I knew he would be waiting farther on, patient as he had said, certain that failure only needed time. Canaan opened before Abram slowly, and it was not like Mesopotamia. The land did not lie flat under canals and brick and smoke. It rose and dipped, hills folded into valleys, and pasture spread between rocky slopes. Trees stood like witnesses in open places. The air was drier, cleaner, less crowded with incense and temple ash. Abram moved through it carefully, not like a conqueror, but like a man afraid to mishandle a gift. At Shechem, near the great tree of Moreh, God appeared again. The presence settled over the place with such weight that every angel in range dropped to his knees. Even the fallen beyond the perimeter recoiled. God promised the land to Abram's offspring. Offspring, children, descendants. The word passed over Abram and Sarai with all its impossibility intact. A man with no child. A woman who had carried disappointment longer than hope had any right to last. A land already occupied. A promise with no visible means of fulfillment. The watching was larger than I had seen since the flood. Not just the detail Michael had deployed. Angels in layers above us observing. Fallen in their own formations beyond the perimeter, tracking, and somewhere above all of it, the throne room of God, where the host of heaven paused to see what this one human would do with the impossible promise he had been given. Abram did not argue. He built an altar, choosing the stones himself. One by one, he lifted them, set them, and adjusted them with hands used to work. He selected the lamb and made the offering. Smoke rose into the still air, thin at first, then darkening, climbing straight upward. Abram worshipped, and I recognized the intensity in him. I had seen it in Noah after the flood. That fierce, quiet decision to honor the God who speaks even when his words don't make the road easier. He did not ask how, nor did he point to Sarai and demand an explanation. He did not look at the people already living in the land and ask how promise and reality were supposed to occupy the same soil. He built an altar and called on the name of the Lord. That was his answer. He moved on from there, southward toward the hills near Bethel and Ai. He pitched his tent, built another altar, and called on the Lord again. Then he moved again, pitching a tent, building an altar, praying and taking the road. That was who he was becoming. He did not yet possess the land, nor did he yet hold a son, nor did he yet understand the promise. But he marked the ground with worship as if worship itself was the first claim faith could make. The seed promise had narrowed again. From all humanity to one family. From one family to one man walking through a land that was not yet his. Beside a wife who had not yet conceived. Following a God who gave promises before explanations. Everything did not rest on Abram because Abram was strong. That would have been easier to understand. It rested on him because God had chosen him, which was harder. I had spent ages watching humans break what God gave them: gardens, brothers, covenants, cities, mercy itself. Sariel was not wrong about their failures. That was what made his accusation dangerous. He told the truth with poison in it. Abram would fail. I knew that. Not how or when, but I knew humans. I knew the dust in them, the fear and the hunger, and how quickly obedience could bend under pressure. And still, watching Abram build altars in a land he did not own, I felt a shift in me. Not certainty, not understanding. Nothing as clean as confidence. Hope. The dangerous kind. The kind that makes the next failure hurt worse because you let yourself believe it might not come. I let myself believe anyway.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.